Now, if you look at the low serotonin theory of depression, they did the same sort of investigations. And as early as 1984, the National Institute of Mental Health, after having done a series of such research, concluded this about that theory. Elevations or decrements in the functioning of serotonergic systems per se are not likely to be associated with depression. That was in 1984 because they were not finding that people with depression prior to being medicated had low serotonergic activity. Anyway, Prozac came to market. We all heard that this fixed a chemical imbalance, but that really was a marketing story to help sell Prozac to us. Anyway, if you go forward, so for example, you can find in a book called Essential Pharmacology. This is written by mainstream biological psychiatry guys in a 2000 textbook, and here's what they say about that theory. They say there is no clear and convincing evidence that monoamine deficiency, serotonin is a monoamine, accounts for depression. That is, there is no real monoamine deficit. Okay, that's what they concluded in 2000. Finally, a man named Kenneth Kimber, co-editor-in-chief of Psychological Medicine in 2005, he summed up this long story about this chemical imbalance theory of mental disorders. He summed up the research, and here's what he concluded. We have hunted for big, simple neurochemical explanations for psychiatric disorders, and we have not found them. Now, why is this important? It's important for many reasons. One, good medicine obviously arises from an honest explication of what you do know and what you don't know. And so for us as a society to become convinced that the medications are fixing chemical imbalances is a story of a societal delusion. And societal delusions generally don't lead to artful use of medications. That's number one. Number two, if you look at the reason we insist on that medications need to be taken for life, because we say they are fixing a physical problem. But the truth is, we do not know what the biology is of mental disorders. We just haven't discovered that. Now, there may be biological factors involved. We just don't know. And the point of this is the stated rationale for continued medication use lifelong is a false rationale, scientifically. And finally, the problem is we now have social, in essence, laws that insist on people in, say, outpatient commitment that they take medications, and it is based on the idea that they are like insulin for diabetes, they're a medicine for a disease. And unfortunately, as we just said, that's not true. Now, it doesn't again mean that the medications may not be helpful, it's just that they're not fixing a known problem, and that can lead to all sorts of, in essence, bad medicine. And finally, I would say one other thing. This actually is a very optimistic story right away. Because if people do not have any known chemical imbalance, well, it may be that for many people, they descend into a serious psychiatric state for whatever reason, environmental reasons, trauma, stress, etc. And yes, they need help, and that help may need medication, but it also opens for a possibility of full recovery. And not even... I was speaking to someone the other day, and it's not to be in recovery. It opens up the possibility of being recovered. And that means on with your life. That you had sort of an episodic problem and you moved on. At least that's a possibility for many, many people. So then we have to ask real quickly, well then what do the drugs do? If they're not fixing chemical imbalances, how do they act on the brain? And here's what you'll find, and this actually came out of the same research. Let's go to the antipsychotics. So they block dopamine receptors in the brain, right? They thwart that transmission. Now the brain, being an extraordinary flexible organ, says in essence, that's a problem. It has feedback mechanisms that try to maintain its dopaminergic transmission, and it does it in this way. The drug is acting as a brake. In response, the brain tries to put down the accelerator. The presynaptic neurons, at least for a time, put out more dopamine, and actually on the postsynaptic neurons, you'll get an increase in the density of dopamine receptors. So upon autopsy about someone with schizophrenia, you will find that they have an increase in dopamine receptors. It's about 50% or 100% more than normal. But that's a reflection of having been on the medication, not the disorder. So here's the sort of paradigm. You have a drug that, say, acts as a brake. The brain tries to compensate by putting down an accelerator. If you look at antidepressants, what are they doing? Antidepressants are blocking the normal reuptake of serotonin. They're keeping that serotonin in a synaptic cleft longer. It's acting as an accelerator, so the brain puts on the brake. The presynaptic neurons, at least for a time, put out less serotonin, and the postsynaptic neurons actually pare away the density of their serotonergic receptors. So they actually go to sort of a lower state. And in 1996, Steve Hyman again, and he was director of the NIMH at this time, he wrote a very key paper called A Paradigm for Understanding Psychotropic Drugs. And he said, these drugs work by, quote, perturbing neurotransmitter systems, and in response, the brain tries to compensate by going through various adaptations. At the end of this process, he wrote, the brain is operating in a manner that is both, quote, qualitatively and quantitatively different than normal. Now, again, that does not mean that this process isn't going to be helpful to some people, and even helpful to some people long term. And I personally know people on the medications long term that are doing great, and so that clearly is one outcome. But what it does tell you when we think about scientifically about what's going on, once you understand that the drugs are perturbing the normal function, and the brain is compensating for it, what do you come to understand? Well, one, you can see why the drugs might cause a lot of side effects, right? And I think most people will admit that they can cause a lot of side effects. Two, it also helps you understand why once you're on the medication, why coming off is so extraordinarily problematic. And think about it. Let's go back to the neuroleptics. The neuroleptics are acting as a brake on dopaminergic transmission. The brain puts down the accelerator. Now you go off the drug abruptly. What do you got left? You do actually still have the accelerator down, and you can see that in a sense that's out of balance. And if you look at why people talk about why relapse is so common when you go off, it's basically this mechanism. It's because the brain is adapted to the presence of the drug. Now the third thing, once we talk about actively, scientifically about what the drugs do, you can see why the long-term outcomes as opposed to the short-term outcomes may be problematic for many patients. Okay, just think about this sort of driving a car, one foot on the accelerator, one foot on the brake all the time. You can see why that might be problematic. Now, once you do that as a journalist and you sort of flesh out, well, what do these drugs really do scientifically? Now you go to the evidence-based literature of studies and you just try to look, do these medications on the whole shift outcomes, say for schizophrenia, for the better or not? For bipolar, for better or not? For anxiety, better or not? Depression, better or not? Etc. And that just becomes, you just go through the literature basically and try to see what they found. All right? And I'm going to do it, I don't have a lot of time here. In the book I do it, as I say, for many disorders. I'll just give you an example of what you find when you look at for schizophrenia. And the reason schizophrenia is a good one to go through is because if anything we believe in, it's that antipsychotics are essential for schizophrenia and they improve the long-term outcomes, and we have a society that is geared up to insist on that. So if anything that maybe we'll see that isn't quite true, we'll see it in this category, okay? Now, what is the evidence base for antipsychotics? So if I were a psychiatrist out here at a psychiatric meeting, how will I say that we know these drugs work? And here it consists of two parts. If you do short-term trials where people are coming into an emergency room with psychotic symptoms, you give one group an antipsychotic, the other group placebo. This group that is given an antipsychotic is doing better at the end of 6 weeks in terms of the diminishment of their psychotic symptoms. That becomes evidence for short-term use. What's the evidence for long-term use? Well, after they began using the drugs, researchers said, well, how long should we use the drugs? And they ran trials that were designed like this. They would take people that were well stabilized on the drug, the psychotic symptoms that had faded, and then they would have one group where they would abruptly withdraw the medication, and in the other group they would maintain them on the medication. And quite regularly, those abruptly withdrawn relapsed at a much greater rate. And so that was seen as the disease returning, and and that therefore you needed to be on the drugs to prevent relapse. Okay, and that's basically the evidence base. They, by the way, have been very few trials that have looked at gradual controlled withdrawal. Anyway, that's the evidence base. What you see in that evidence base, that tells you nothing about people functioning well long term. It doesn't tell you about employment, it doesn't tell you about people becoming engaged. And in 2005, I think it was, Emmanuel Stipp, he's a famous researcher from the Montreal University. He says, do we know that antipsychotics improve the long-term outcome of schizophrenia? And he looked through the literature and he said, there is no good evidence. And then he said, in an editorial on European Psychiatry, he said, if we wish to base psychiatry on evidence-based medicine, we run a genuine risk in taking a closer look at what has long been considered fact. And in essence, what I do in this book then is take a closer look at that evidence. Now, real quickly with schizophrenia, what you're going to try to do is you try to figure out, are we improving the long-term course? Well, what you first need to do is, what's the natural spectrum of outcomes for people diagnosed with schizophrenia? And so what I did is I went back to studies in 1945 to 1955, epidemiological studies, that studied initial cohorts of schizophrenia patients, people hospitalized for a first episode of schizophrenia. And what you find in those studies is that about 60 to 70% would be discharged from the hospital within 12 to 18 months. And that at the end of 3 to 5 years, around 70 to 75% of those patients would be living in the community, independently, not on any sort of disability. Employment rates at this time were above 50%. Which of course is optimistic. By the way, in the UK did a big 5-year study at this time too, and what did they find for schizophrenia patients? And they were defining schizophrenia in a much more narrow fashion. You had to be sicker in the UK to get the schizophrenia diagnosis. They found 5 years later, 1/3 were just not schizophrenic anymore. By that I mean they just didn't have psychotic symptoms. Another 20–25% were well enough that they could work. So in other words, more than 50% were working. Okay, and now, about, again in the UK and here, there was about 1/3 that was becoming chronically ill. So you saw this spectrum of outcomes. Now, real quickly, let's look at the long-term literature for schizophrenia and how medications affect that. The first good study of antipsychotics was done in the early 1960s. It was done by the National Institute of Mental Health. It had 4 arms. 3 groups were treated with drug, the 4th were with placebo. At the end of 6 weeks, the drug-treated patients were doing better. There were many placebo patients that had gotten better, but not as many as those on drug. Then they came back a year later. This is the first year later study we have. And they came up with something surprising. They said for some reason, it was the placebo patients who were less likely to be re-hospitalized. So right at the beginning of the outcomes literature, we see the possible hint of a paradox. Drugs that scientifically are effective over the short term, is it possible they're actually increasing the chronicity of the disorder long term?